A little bit about what you're going to hear today, really just talking about how you can avoid bad situations, and really these things should apply no matter what you're using. I don't get to talk much about Amazon because Amazon is a little bit secretive about certain things, which is everything, really. But again, that said, I can tell some good stories over a beer, so I may leave out the names of the guilty, but there are some really fun things I could talk about. So, I'm sure your first question, because you all love Dante, you've read all of the Divine Comedy again and again. How come you only have 7 circles? Dante has 9 circles. So the first is really just alliteration, rolls off the tongue. We want to kind of keep it fun for everyone. But more importantly today, because we've only got half an hour, we got to keep this short. So brevity, soul of wit, all that good stuff. But the first thing, you're going to see this slide more than once. We're going to tell you the solutions up front. It's about governance, it's about investment, it's about people, and again, a lot of you in the room will know these things, but you'll be able to take this slide deck back to the people who sign the checks and be able to say, the lady with the purple hair said that we have to do these things, and that if we don't, it's actually going to be more expensive in the long run. So circle 1, and again, I'm going to kind of move back and forth because I'm one of those people who gets bored if I'm standing in one place. No metadata. We've all been here. Here's how it makes us feel. We don't like this. We get really, really grumpy. So, and just to give you guys a little bit of an idea of the framework too, I'm going to tell sort of longer and longer stories as we go along, but this one's an easy one. We've all been there. We've all had maybe a half dozen assets with no metadata, or maybe a couple million assets with no metadata, and these are not fun places to be in, but that's at least an easy thing where you can say, here's the problem, and this is bad, and here's why. So we won't dwell too much on this one, but just know that we all feel your pain. It makes us have a sad. We don't want to be in this situation. But circle 2, automated metadata. That sounds great, right? I know we talked a little bit about this on the last panel. There was some really, really good, rich discussion about that, and there's certainly a place for that. However, again, you can't just do that. And I think a lot of what I want you to take away from this, and again, which a lot of you guys will know already, but you need to sometimes go back and do a little bit of myth busting for your senior leadership or for whomever's really signing the checks again. Always go back to these people. You have to have good relationships with your executive sponsors, or really have a good relationship with legal, who can also kind of help you out a little bit as well. So there are certainly really, really useful ways you can automate some of your metadata, whether that's on ingestion, you're getting a lot of fields pre-filled, or or whether you are doing some AI in a little bit, but there can be a perception, again, kind of usually amongst the people who are a little further removed from the process, that you can just automate all of it. You can get rid of all the people who are doing this, and as you know, that doesn't work. But I think I really sort of liken it to how outsourcing has been going on for the past kind of 15 or 20 years, is you see this move in a cycle where people are like, oh, we can outsource all of that, and then they end up hiring everyone back about 6 to 12 months later. I've seen this as well with metadata automation, and again, it tends to happen more at some of the big companies because they're the ones who have the cash to invest in automating this stuff. So there's a lot of stuff you can automate, that's for sure, but they fall into that trap of thinking, we can do it all. So I actually have a couple people working for me now who in a previous incarnation of the Amazon taxonomy system all got laid off because machines were going to do it and solve it all for us. And then it didn't, and they all came back. So again, there's certainly a place for this. This is great if you want to get things in kind of large buckets to then have someone review. But again, as you know, it doesn't solve all the problems. It's not a panacea. It's definitely a great starting point if you've got time in there to really train your models, and you've got the resources in there to spend time doing that. But I think another point too around automating your metadata is it still costs money to do that. Even if you're not paying for headcount, also think of what you're paying in terms of your processing time. Think about what's happening there, so that there are, this may not be coming out of your budget, but there's a line item for this somewhere, even if you're not necessarily seeing it. So again, you may need to go back to your finance people and say, it's not as cheap as it looks, and it's not as 100% efficient as it looks. User-supplied metadata. We talked a little bit about this too in the last panel. Those guys did an amazing job. And again, this is one of those things. There's absolutely a place for it. There are some really, really cool crowdfunding things, or crowdfunding as well, but crowdsourcing initiatives out there. I've worked on some really cool ones, especially in the museum space and in academia, where there's absolutely a place for it, but sometimes that can lead to this. Now, there's a way to get around your issues. Even if you're doing this, you're getting the users to tag things. what are some ways we can work around that? Obviously, controlled vocabulary is our friend if we want to make sure that people are only picking from things we really want them to be picking from. There's all sorts of ways where you can go back in and clean it up later, but again, you have to build that into part of your process. You have to make sure that out of this sea of things you're getting from your users out there in the world, that you're able to really kind of narrow it down, make sure you're doing a reconciliation, that you're really kind of getting these terms much more narrow, and that you can really keep that afloat. And also, I think you want to make a really clear distinction between your descriptive metadata and all of your administrative metadata. Hopefully, you're not having just sort of Joe or Jane random user out on the internet supplying your administrative metadata, although that would certainly be interesting if they're starting to let you know what regions you can use this image in, or where they think it came from. And you could really kind of rewrite the history of any individual asset if you're not super careful about what they do and don't have access to, what they can and can't see. So I think, again, there's absolutely a place for it, but you really want to be thoughtful about how you're creating those programs and how you're reconciling what's out there and how you really have that governance built in. So I'm going to keep coming back to governance, because governance is magical and special and is really what makes this all run, because without it you have just a sea of terminology that you can't really do much with. So stale metadata, this is one of my favorite things, because I think we've all been in that situation where your organization's like, well, we have this dam and now we have all the stuff in it and we're done. We've solved world hunger, it's all fine. But, and then they're really excited because they're like, it has metadata, this is awesome, we don't need to worry about it anymore. So I have two stories I'm going to tell about what happens when your metadata gets stale. And in both of these cases, we have to sort of protect the guilty. Again, there will not be any company names used with this, but one of my favorite ones is where no one had ever bothered checking what the dates were for usage rights on things, and they just kept sort of going. There was no review process built in. The particular dam that was being used by the people in question, who may or may not have been me and my team, but I'll just say there were people involved who could have done a better job in retrospect, but the software we had didn't let you have any kind of reminders to go in and actually re-review these things. There was a kind of review workflow you could set up to make sure you were doing that, but people get busy. People are just very busy adding new stuff into the system. They kind of forget that they have both sort of technical debt and process debt, all kinds of other stuff floating around out there. So, you kind of keep going, and then later you get some nice cease and desist letters from whichever stock house is like, hey, you guys haven't paid us for like 3 years. That's not cool. And then you start to realize, oh, they've actually embedded metadata in those files. They've got invisible watermarks. They've got all kinds of clever things, and we should have done a better job of really staying on top of that. So again, build in those re-reviews as part of your process, but also, it's good fun if you work for a company that starts to get those letters and is like, look, it's only a couple $1 million. This is not something we need to worry about. And you're like, but we could have hired someone who could make that their job. And they're like, that would cost money because headcount is bad and scary. But it's okay to spend a couple $1 million just on watching money waft out the door for some organizations. Again, not my current one, because Amazon is frugal. That wouldn't fly. But other places I have worked are I'll say a little less challenged with those kind of constraints, and are happy to spend a lot of money on things they shouldn't be spending money on, things they shouldn't be spending their customers' money on, but also just kind of bad things there. And another story I'm going to tell about stale metadata, maybe a little more closely related to my current job. I couldn't say for certain because that would be telling, but I'll say in very broad terms, sometimes the meanings of things change, and you may have a term applied to a particular genre that was super cool when people came up with it, but you didn't really have any review. And over time, sometimes those words become hurtful to people, or really have been the whole time and no one was paying attention. But if you have a whole genre of books about, did I say books? You have a whole genre of things about some of these terms that, over time have come to mean not super nice things. You want to kind of fix that and make sure that people who actually understand, who are subject matter experts on these things, are able to really, make sure that what you've got there really makes sense. So again, this comes back to governance, thinking about who's giving you that sort of feedback? Who is there who's going to have that voice of the customer, and who is there to really make sure that you're not just sort of one person alone in your ivory tower, even though sometimes you are the one person alone in your basement trying to make these things happen. But you want to make sure you're getting that regular feedback so that you can go back in, you are re-reviewing your metadata, and whether that's the broader structure of your metadata or whether that's just making sure that things you've got out there as terms are still terms that are meaningful to people. And that can be as easy as making sure that you've got product names updated, making sure that, I think a little earlier, again, we were hearing about code names. If those change over time, you want to make sure your internal people can find them. But this is especially important when you have stuff that's visible to the wider world. You want to make sure that you don't want to make people angry or hurt them with what you've got in there. And sometimes that does happen, so don't do that. So, too much metadata. And I know, again, some people have opinions about this. I have opinions about this. And this is where I go with it. So, for me, there is that sweet spot. We were talking again a little bit earlier. So in a previous role, I think we had, I think the number of fields that had to be manually entered and that were required fields, in a previous system there were 47 individual required fields that had to be entered by humans on the other end. And guess what? They didn't do that. So you ended up with a no metadata situation. So again, you want to make sure that you have everything you need, and especially when you are using things in a lot of different regions for a lot of different purposes, you want to have that kind of, it always feels good to have more, but if you're getting so little uptake, whether there's just so much of it or it's so difficult to deal with the particular system, you want to kind of narrow down, really winnow out what's important. And what we did in that particular situation is I did finally get a group of users together, sat them down in a room, and I think I probably had to bribe them with cake as well, but cake can work, cookies are good. Alcohol is if you want really, really good results, you want to, you'll actually get people to come to that. So that's always worth trying. But they really sat down and said, I'm not going to use any of these things. I don't know what these things mean, or these aren't relevant to my department. And then you're going to have a little horse trading over some of them. That's okay too, as long as you're ending up with a number that people are actually going to use. At the end of the day, you're always going to come back to usability, whether that's finding it as an end user or being able to administer it. But again, sometimes it seems like you're going to have everything. You're going to have this amazing description of things, but a lot of times people just don't want to go there. So you have to really find what's going to work for your users. And you can tie this back too to the automation as well. If you can automate some of those required fields, that certainly makes things a little bit easier. So you can take some of these things that on their own are not great situations, combine them together, and get to a place that's a little bit better. But I think, again, this is one of these things where it always seems like the more the merrier, but when you get right down to it, at the end of the day, people, processes, technology, what are people actually going to do? And you have to really kind of incentivize them if it's going to be harder than it really should be. And this is one of my favorite things. And this is one of the things that makes me super sad when it actually happens to me. So we've all been in this situation, I'm sure, where there's a migration and you're told everything is going to be just fine. You've spent months probably planning these things out. You've gone through all sorts of fun card sorting exercises. You've worked with the vendor, and they're like, no, these one or two look like they might have a slightly different name, but it's really the same. It's going to be totally fine. And then you have your big migration. You move those first couple of things over, and then you suddenly realize, oh, no, it's different. This is not what happened when we did this in the sandbox. All sorts of strange things happen. And then you often, again, I know there's some wonderful vendors here, but and it's not you guys, it's the other guys. So it's not the good vendors. But you'll have someone come back and be like, oh, well, those are actually on the roadmap. And you're like, oh, but that's not what we talked about. But I think we've all been in a situation where they're either on the roadmap or you can fix it if you recode it. So there's a lot of like, your developers are going to do that. No, your developers are going to do that. So again, the way to avoid this, just make sure you actually have the people in the room when those decisions are being made. Before you actually go and sign those contracts, make sure that the end users have actually had a chance to test this. I mean, I'm sure you heard some of this in the choosing a dam thing, but even if you're replacing something or even just migrating to a new version, I've had some fun times too where just a patch seemed to destroy like half the metadata we were looking for, and that's another fun thing too, is once it's actually migrated over, is it in the same place? Are you able to find it, or did it just completely disappear? And I think that's one of those things we could go on and on about for a long time, is what is the value of the actual metadata? Like that, it's still a business object that you've really spent the time to build and curate, and it's worth something, and you need to kind of remind your organization that that is something in the mix as well. And then here's where you guys all come into play. These are the mystery policies that a lot of times your organization doesn't know about or knows about and maybe interprets differently. But a lot of times at the end of the day, they just ignore you. So how can you think about how to get around that? And again, this is going to depend on the size of your organization. There's a lot you can do here, but I'm going to tell another fun story here. So a lot of times, especially if you're working with this very large global company, again, not my current one, but a previous one, people just don't know what the rules are. People have been moving around from job to job. They don't necessarily know what a good creative workflow looks like. But back in the day, I was going through some files in the DAM with my digital archivist who was doing an amazing job. And we found an image of a headshot of an actor that was being used in, let's see, what's the best way to put this? That was being used in what we called a sensitive ad all around the world. So it was, some young actors, 8x10, was being used in a not Viagra ad somewhere out in the world. And it turned out that the person who had uploaded that file into our DAM had actually just done a Google image search, pulled the image out, and stuck it in there, and it was getting used globally. So don't do that. That's bad. But yes, in this case, SAG did not come after us, but they could have. They could have been well within their rights to come out there, to come out after us. There's a whole lot of things about sort of talent releases, things that had never happened. And again, you have people who don't know. The folks, as the person running your DAM, you have to kind of go out there and advocate not just for people to use your system, but to make sure that they know what the rules are very broadly. You have to make it so easy for them to be able to kind of come in, find out what they are, and because people are busy, they don't necessarily have time, but a lot of times you just kind of do need to explain what the rules are and why they're there, and you do want to go back and say, sometimes these things cost a lot of money if we get them wrong, and sometimes people get fired if we get them wrong. And if you're in pharma or if you're in things like financial services, sometimes people go to jail if you get these things wrong. So again, it depends how heavy you want to make the hammer, but ideally you can bring the carrot or the cookies or the beer to try to do that instead. But definitely it's good if you've got a couple of examples of bad things that can happen but are not going to happen because we have this. And it's really all because we have the right things in the system, we have them described the right way, and everyone has played their role in making sure that they are able to have the right stuff in there with the right metadata. You're able to know where you can use it, know why you can use it, know when you can use it, all that good stuff. But again, you have to get out there, be an advocate for the system, really tell people why this stuff is important, and hopefully you're not starting from that point, but understand that your education may have to really start kind of at a very, very, very basic level. So again, solutions, governance, investment, people, these are all the things you're going to keep coming back to again. So these are the things you really need. Make sure you've got some standards. Not going to go and read through the slide because I know we're coming up to time, but these are all the things that really, really, really help make your job easier, help make the job of anyone entering the metadata a little bit easier. But you really want to think about, how do I make it easier? How do I make it portable? How do I make sure that this stuff is going to be as future-proof as it can be? It's not about the system. It's really about what you put in place to make it easy for people to use and really make sure that you know what, that you're driving the behavior you want. So that can be really hard to figure out depending on your org, but it's definitely the way forward. So again, this is the slide that you can kind of take away. You can give this to all of your senior executives back at the ranch, wherever you happen to be, and say, you need these people to make this run. You need to have rules to make this run, and you need to invest in this to make it run. The things at the bottom are the things that are going to kind of keep the wheels turning, but again, the people and the governance paying for it, these are the things that get you good quality metadata that make sure you don't end up getting hit with millions and millions of dollars in fines, or that you're able to just find things like you can really tell the story about your metadata to depending on really frame it the way you want that particular executive or that particular person who needs to know more about it, whether it's about findability, whether it's about saving money. Just make sure you're telling the right story to the right person who needs to know.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you very much.